Okay, so first news story of the week. I'm actually going to bring in Oliver to talk about this one because it's a game that he has covered for the review. And we think this one's really important. Star Wars Outlaws has quote unquote dropped on Switch 2. And it's a bit of a revelation, I think it's fair to say. It's the first game that we're aware of on the Switch 2 that is actually using hardware accelerated ray tracing with the Snowdrop engine from Ubisoft Massive. It's using DLSS 2. And obviously, there were concerns about that game pre-launch because the media that was supplied by Ubisoft wasn't particularly exciting or impressive in any way. Meanwhile, there was a PAX West demo as soon as last week that actually wasn't looking particularly impressive either. But the final game has arrived, and it's pretty impressive. It's a massive statement, I think, about the capabilities of the system for current gen ports. Mm-hmm. Oliver, you're joining us on this one. And yeah, how do you want to tackle it?
Well, I think as I put it to you initially, I was shocked when I got this one because...
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? You said you were shocked, and I was saying, well, what? Good shocked or bad shocked? And it's a good shock.
It's a good shock. It's a good shock here. Unfortunately, in the media that was supplied to us before release, and this is going back months, this is going back to like May of this year, roughly speaking, when we got that first initial glimpse of the game running in handheld mode, apparently at the Ubisoft stream. They were very cagey about it, like they weren't publishing a lot of material from it, and the material they did publish was often running in the low to mid 20s. It was not running very well at all. The visuals did not look necessarily perfect all the time, but the issue was predominantly that performance that was there, that was not up to standard for a game like this. And usually you expect, people want to show off the game at their best, and apparently the game was not in a very cromulent shape until relatively recently, because that PAX West demo, like you pointed out, was just a few days ago. I think it was about a week ago or so. But yeah, on Switch 2, it looks like Star Wars Outlaws. It still has RTGI, RT reflections, and RT shadows for distant objects as well, the kind of distant terrain, which is quite good. And it's cut back in some significant ways. There are obviously some concessions in terms of the ray traced lighting fidelity, where it's cut back a little bit in terms of the RTGI. There's a little bit more noise in the presentation. But overall, it looks very much like Star Wars Outlaws. Compared to Series S, it even trades blows with it on a couple of axes. It actually runs better than Series S, probably. In terms of image quality, there are some advantages on Switch. Obviously, you have DLSS there versus FSR. There are a lot of areas where the Switch port is really impressive. And it kind of is scaled non-linearly, where there are some things where there is a significant cutback on Switch. But there are other areas, again, like image quality, like performance, like even the fidelity of some of the ray traced reflections and things like that, where Switch is actually doing a comparable job. In a couple places, I even spotted ray traced reflections on Switch where they weren't present on Series S. They were cut on Series S, present on Switch. Again, this speaks to a ton of work from Ubisoft, Red Link, Berlin, and Massive on this project. And I think it speaks to some of the Switch 2's unique architectural advantages over its contemporary current-gen console counterparts there. I'm super impressed by this. It's, I would say, by a good margin, the most impressive port I've seen on Switch 2 at the moment. It really portends strong things, I think, for the future of Switch 2 ports if, with sufficient effort, with sufficient blood, sweat, and tears, if a developer can really pull results like this out of the Switch 2 hardware, that's a very good sign.
Mm-hmm. And John, you've spent some hours with this now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I played this just as a player, essentially, since I'm not covering it, which allowed me to basically sit down in front of the TV and, of course, handheld, and just sort of take in the game, having played through it on PC. So I have only experienced the ultra high-end version of this game. But I have to admit, I'm so impressed with this. Like, it genuinely feels like a very low compromise version in a way. So before talking about some of the big compromises I did notice, though, I will say, right away, the HDR experience is there. The frame time's super stable. There's no stuttering or weirdness. Everything just, plays out very consistently. Like, when you look back at, the quote-unquote impossible ports that we used to talk about on Switch 1, going back to, Doom and whatnot, those Witcher as well, very impressive, as we noted, but they always had very noticeable sacrifices in certain areas. There was frame pacing issues with Doom, for instance, right? There's little issues here and there, things that do compromise the experience in an annoying way, but you just kind of had to say, well, it's running on Switch. What do you expect, right? I don't feel like that's the case here. which is interesting. Like, this actually does not have that same feeling as the impossible ports on Switch 1. It genuinely feels like it's more comparable with its bigger brethren. Like, it's akin to, like, it's weird to say it, but it's like comparing, say, like, I don't know, a base PS4 game to Xbox One X or something, or maybe even Xbox One versus Xbox One X, where it still feels like it's the same generation, but with cuts that you expect. And I think that's super cool. I was also happy to see, like, despite the default settings, so all the preview footage, aside from looking choppy and not good, especially those trailers, one of the things that was really missing was motion blur. And you know I love my motion blur, right, in these types of games. It's there. Not only is it there, it's just off by default, but you can adjust the camera and object motion blur settings independently. So if you like that per object motion blur, which I think is the one that most users would agree looks pretty cool, you can crank that up, turn the camera down or lower the camera so it's not as blurry, and that helps a lot. It also has the lens distortion effect, which again, off by default, but it is there. It also has ultra wide support, not actual ultra wide support, but it's the 21:9 letterbox mode from the console. So if you want that, you can turn it on. I played on the LG G4 with HDR enabled. HDR looks really good, but weirdly enough, I was not able to adjust the sliders in the game. So, like, they were visible, HDR was working, but couldn't adjust the sliders for some reason. Not sure why. But so all of that impressed me a lot. It loads a little slower, but still fast enough. And that's something we'll talk about momentarily. But what I found really interesting is if you really look closely at the things that they had to cut, like the RTs there, like a lot of the stuff is there, the core features, but they massively pared back geometry, but in a very interesting way. Like, it feels like they ran some sort of like auto LOD adjustment thing to like just sort of like nip and tuck triangles away from like everything. Like, if you look at, like, if you're walking through town and you look at all the buildings, the arches, the little objects, everything is just missing a bit of geometry. And it's stuff you don't necessarily notice when you're just playing it naturally. But if you start to look close and compare, you'll see, like, wait, this arch is less rounded. Or, like, the edges on this counter, instead of being smoothed off, it's just like a harsh, like, squared off edge, right? Like, little details like that, which I would say not a big deal in terms of the overall experience, but it's definitely there, and it kind of suggests like where they were bottlenecking on the Switch 2. And to me, I actually view those cuts as like a good thing, because it shows that they were really thinking about this port. Like, how do we make this look and run well while still giving the feeling of being like the original game? And taking that kind of approach, I don't know, I think it's really cool. And it shows that they were really trying to like dial this in to match what the Switch 2 could do, but while preserving that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my thoughts on this. I mean, what can I say? Cyberpunk, impressive port. It's a benchmark game, right? It's interesting to note that they actually also introduced some custom geometry reductions and LOD differentials there to actually make that possible. So it's not really a surprise to see that happening here with Outlaws. But I just want to sort of talk more holistically about why this is important, why this game is important, because well, what can we say? Pretty much every port we've seen so far has been from a game that has been designed to scale across the generations. Like, Cyberpunk is the game to kind of showcase this. It's the game that was designed to run on anything from a base Xbox One up to like the most high-end PC. So essentially CD Projekt Red had the ability to pick and choose what they wanted from all of those scalability options they had. Now, what's interesting about Star Wars Outlaws, of course, is that it's an engine that was designed primarily for the current generation, exclusively for the current generation, in fact. And it's also very difficult to run on like older PC hardware, especially like the handhelds and stuff like that. So the concept of them being able to create this game and produce a highly creditable version. I mean, it's hitting all the marks. Resolution looks good, which is great. The ray tracing is there. I mean, the game probably wouldn't even run without ray tracing. It kind of had to be there for this port to be viable. So the concept that this was actually all doable and all possible albeit, obviously some degree of effort went into this port, there are extra scalability options that are now built in that maybe Series S could have benefited from to a certain extent. But, basically the idea that Nintendo rolls up with a console 5 years after Microsoft and Sony, 4.5 years, and we're unsure as to whether it could handle current gen ports. That was kind of like one of our key concerns about the system, but this game shows that it can be done, that those current gen games can actually arrive on Switch 2, which is great, which is kind of what we wanted to see, and obviously disrupts the narrative set by their own pre-release media and demos, which again is quite astonishing. Alex, curious about your thoughts about this.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, just regarding the geometry thing, I don't want to steal any thunder from Oliver's video, but if I recall, the PC version of the Ubisoft Massive games has a great, I forget what they call it. It's a slider that goes up to 200%. And it's it controls geometry quality at a distance. And with that, you can see a lot of extra added detail in the geometric quality at a distance. And maybe it's just them playing with that, like a negative value for it, for example.
Feels like the return of tessellation.
Yeah, something like that. And
basically.
So that was just something I was thinking about while you were talking about that. But with the rest of it, I'm very curious about how this porting was done, because the console versions of this engine use a very specific custom ray tracing path for it. They do actually some of like the BVH building on the CPU. Some of it's on the GPU as well, which is very atypical to do any of that kind of stuff on the CPU at all. They have like custom intersection for a lot of things. These are all things that they did to make it run on RDNA 2, which is very bad at ray tracing. Then they have Ampere, which on the other hand has like automated functions for those kind of things, right? So I'm very curious to see if they ported what they did there or if they relied on what they had as part of what the hardware package is. And those are all questions I would love to ask them in an interview. Mm-hmm. I hope we can get an interview with the people responsible for this port, because it is very intriguing. I actually have yet to load it up. Rich did send me a key. I was like, oh, I got to find the time for that. I have yet to do it yet. But I would love to see it in person, because it does sound pretty cool. And I'm really wondering how they managed it.
Alex, thinking about that, to me, I was thinking like, okay, so the Switch obviously is heavily crippled Ampere in the fact that it's turned way down, right? Yes. But it also kind of speaks to the efficiency of its RT hardware versus RDNA 2. So even when sort of crippled in the way that Switch 2 is, it easily trades blows and can possibly exceed the lower end RDNA 2 consoles. So, right. Which makes me think that ray tracing on Switch 2 won't really be that much of a bottleneck outside of maybe the CPU side. And in fact, CPU seems like it's going to be the largest bottleneck for anything Switch related going forward. So we'll see how that plays out. But this is good news, right? Like we finally get to see the Switch doing proper ray tracing, and not just like light ray tracing, but like serious stuff. Yeah,
this is a 30 FPS Series S game, but critically on the other consoles with largely identical CPUs, right? It is a 60 FPS title in its performance mode, so perhaps that frees up some CPU resources there.
It shows a bit of an unbalance between them, right? Yeah. Where like Series S has more limitations on the GPU side, maybe, that make it
very much so
60 off the table.
On the Switch 2, even though it's rendering at a much lower resolution, because it's using DLSS and its output is like 1440p docked, 1080p handheld, it still looks really attractive and smooth and clean.
Dude, yeah. I especially did you notice with the reflections, like when you're looking at like the water areas out and then in the sort of the fields there, right? Like I feel like especially at a distance, they're more stable on Switch 2 versus what you see on like Series S.
There's definitely some trade-offs. Like I feel like they're more kind of temporally coherent. But then you look at like the resolution is a little lower, but
it's lower.
But because I think in Snowdrop, in these Snowdrop engine titles, they're really they don't have very many just like plain mirror surfaces. Really, they kind of tend to make them look a little bit rougher. So you don't really notice that as much. And I think like it's kind of interesting because I actually do agree that I would kind of compare it to some of the impossible ports that we saw on Switch. But the kind of weird thing about the impossible ports, or the kind of thing about the impossible ports that made sense at the time, was like, if you look at it again, like Doom, which you brought up, or The Witcher, it was like every single thing they did, take the PS4 version or take the Xbox One version and scale it down. Like models, dump. Image quality, dump. Whatever.
Down.
In this case, it's like, okay, well, the ray tracing looks very similar. Like, it honestly looks very similar. Image quality is very similar. They cut like geometry and the asset density. You notice that in some scenes, in particular, when they like remove some cabling on Switch, when they make something really obvious, right? That's present in a few areas, especially in like some of the city areas, some of the open world areas where you really do notice that difference. There's less like asset density when it comes to like grass and foliage and things like that as well. But in a lot of scenes, if you flip back and forth, you can't really see the differences until you start to look really closely. Like, look really closely at that cable or that rounded surface, and it's a little chunkier on Switch. Not much, subtly, a little chunkier. That texture, a little softer, things like this. And the reality is the game is like 62 gigs on Series S, 20.2 gigs on Switch 2.
Yeah,
that's they
wild.
cut it down massively, but in reality, it's kind of like I'm
Massive.
flipping back and forth. Massive. Yeah, massive entertainment. I'm flipping back and forth here, and I'm like, geez, am I losing it? Like, this looks really similar in a lot of weird ways that I was not expecting, especially from the pre-release stuff, which is not suggesting it in this stable of a form.
So the thing about this port that made me think so recently, kind of a separate game, but there was this rumor going around that, Resident Evil Requiem's coming to Switch 2 and PlayStation 4, right? And this got me thinking about this idea of like, wait, if that game's built fully with ray tracing in mind, now we see like bringing that to Switch 2, it should be very feasible. But doing it on PS4, not so much, because like Outlaws, I would imagine the game is built with ray trace lighting from the ground up, and changing it would require them to re-engineer and re-art a complete fallback solution, right? Which is possible, but that's going to cost a fair amount of money and time, right? Like if they had to go into Outlaws here and strip out all the ray tracing features, that would have meant like redoing all the lighting in the game using like an old like probe based solution or something, and like basically like doing a bunch of engineering work, a bunch of artwork. Like that's not a trivial task. So like I feel like this really shows that the Switch 2 is capable of current gen experiences in a way that you can't backport to PlayStation 4 so easily.
Going back to the Series S comparisons there, Oliver, I think it's fair to say that there are some reductions to RT quality, right, on Switch 2. But I think the one thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about a machine here that's basically running at like 25% of the power draw.
Yeah,
less than 25% potentially when you're looking at docked play, which is pretty astonishing, right?
Yeah, I would say like the primary difference that you notice between the platforms is that when you look at Series S versus Switch 2, Switch 2 is just noisier. Like right there, fewer rays being shut out. It's a noisier presentation, especially if you go over time. If you look at something like a scene that's very, indirect in shade, moving the camera side to side with the right stick, you see breakup and holes in the RTGI. And you'll notice that across platforms, basically in everything but PC, with the kind of higher end settings there with the ray reconstruction there. And you'll see more of that kind of noise, more of that kind of breakup on Switch 2, but not obnoxiously so. It's a little, it's a moderate.
That's why you want motion blur.
Exactly. Well, you can turn on the motion blur, and that solves that issue to some degree. At least it makes it less apparent, visually apparent. But even if you're going slowly with the camera, you can notice some of these issues. In general, those are compromises that you'll see across all platforms. Any kind of issues with Switch 2 that you can kind of allege are probably also issues with the Series X release, or with the Series S release, and to a lesser extent the Series S, X, and PS5 releases.
Going to take some supporter questions on this one. We'll start with this one from Critically Wild. Has Outlaws on Switch 2 opened any doors in your minds in terms of Switch 2's capabilities overall? Earlier assets were really rough and it seemed like it couldn't wind up as good as it has. That talk did seem to center around the hardware more than what the devs could pull off. So doors opened ajar. I think it's fair to say that this does seemingly put ray tracing on the table in a way that we kind of suspected was possible based on some of the PC projections we did. So I'm going to be really interested to see if, I'm assuming that at some point Control is going to be ported to the Switch 2. And I do think the ray trace reflections are actually a really good potential route forward for Switch 2 based on those GPU projections we did. What do you think, Alex?
I mean, yeah, I think this opens the table for those. The thing is, the CPU still does get in the way. So one thing that this game does that other games can't do necessarily is this game doesn't have any of the dynamic objects really moving or in there at all. It's all covered in screen space. And that way it has similar, at least on the highest PC settings change that, but that has more similarities to something like Software Lumen in that aspect, where dynamics are not really a part of the situation. And as soon as that becomes part of it, you've got like the question of like what is running on the CPU there, and also kind of like what is the BVH build time on the GPU, because as soon as that starts ballooning, that's something you can't really compact down. It's just a flat cost, unlike things like resolution or ray count. So I think this shows as a great proof of concept, but I would still not say like every ray tracing experience fits on the Switch as a result of it. But it definitely lends itself to it, at least as a good proof of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This question from Dajarko in brackets, Dan, happy half fortnight lads, ! With everyone and their dog eating their hats over the Switch 2 port of Star Wars Outlaws, does this bode well for other Snowdrop Engine games? For instance, a possible Frontiers of Pandora port, or perhaps a version of the upcoming Splinter Cell remake. Is this the first game on Switch 2 that is using hardware-accelerated RT effects in addition to using DLSS upscaling? On the latter point, I think it probably is. Almost certainly is. But what about Avatar, Oliver? This one, that would be quite tricky, I think, but not impossible based on this.
Avatar has very different kinds of content to this game, I think. Yeah. And I kind of think of like Akiva, which is, I think you do see some custom settings there to kind of adjust things and make it work. And you see some real reductions in the draw distance of all the foliage and all the trees and things like that. And I kind of think that Avatar is more like Akiva than it's like Toshara or Tatooine or these other places that are basically flat plains, maybe with some grasses. I think the more kind of vertical and asset dense and crazy, and you look at Avatar and it's got just so much stuff everywhere. And I kind of just think, would that work well on Switch 2? Would that work well? I think it's kind of a different set of challenges, perhaps, especially with like the huge lines of sight in Avatar and all the trees that you kind of need to see out pretty far into the distance all the time for gameplay reasons. I think we're already seeing Switch 2 bottleneck a bit on geometry in Star Wars Outlaws, which is why you see all the kind of widespread asset changes in the game. I think in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, that would be much more pronounced, and you'd basically have kind of like a supercharged Akiva